So anyway, the discussion today, Carey, and I think it came up last night, Tom, the biggest issue, and I have to say, Carey, bench management is the biggest issue, and you probably have figured out a way to get the best results, making everybody feel a part of the team, because you played everybody with everybody at different times in all situations. Now, Tom and I don't think we did that exactly like you did. I did it in a simple way, but I did manage combinations and people together differently. I never really created a structure of first line, second line, third line for the season. But everybody got to play with different people. And yeah, there were line depths. I started a different line every period, which meant they really didn't know, and I started a different line every game. And it was just a part of the culture that you create, that you don't create a hierarchy to begin with. And Carey, that's what we're talking about, because right now in minor hockey, as you know, you experienced with your son's AAA boys team, they declared right away 4 lines, and they defined the roles for those lines at the beginning of the season, really not knowing their capabilities and how they might evolve. So, Carey, your bench management, and Tom, I just admire the way you coach, because every team you've coached, you manage the bench unbelievably. Everybody feels a part of the team. Everybody can play all situations. And I think that's the art of coaching. And I want to edit this for coaches at all levels, but particularly girls hockey, because we have a number of coaches that, they're really good until the score gets close. And then they tend to shorten the bench for the sake of winning. And you do that too soon, too often, you won't have a team that's going to be successful. That's my firm belief. So, Carey, I wonder if you could talk a bit about, the bench management piece over your experience in years and what you ended up doing, winning national championships when you coached. And I wanted to take it from here, because basically I want the listeners, when I edit this, to just get a better understanding of what it takes to motivate players to play at their best. And you and I talked yesterday about the teams that win the Stanley Cup, and last year was a perfect example. They literally roll 4 lines. So go ahead, Carey, and I'll let you take it away. And I'm looking forward to everybody else's input. And Jordan may not be on right now, but when he does get on, he totally believes in the
here.
So, try to influence, motivate, coach in a motivational fashion, which I mean transmit belief. Go ahead, Carey. I'm going to turn it over to you. For everybody that's here, I sent out Carey's PDF and I figured it out last night, Carey. I think I've got a handle on how that works. And I do have some questions about it when we get into it later. So I'm going to let you take over on the bench management piece and the development piece, because you've had more success than any of us. Go ahead.
Geez, thanks, Wally. I don't know. You guys have all had a lot of success, so I'm pretty humbled on that one. Over the years when I played the game, I got to watch a lot of great coaches, guys like Wally and Donnie, and played for a lot of good guys, played for a lot of average guys. And, when I started coaching, it became apparent to me that, the management of the bench, is something that is vital to creating a good experience for the kids and the parents. And, and also the utilization of high energy and having energy to play the whole game. And I played on teams where two lines would play more than other lines, and the coach was in love with two players that were exhausted and they couldn't even breathe by the third period, let alone be effective. But because they were the so-called stars or whatever, they took over the team, and in the end we would lose because the bench management wasn't, in my opinion, done properly. So if I go back in history, it was quite the norm 30 years ago where there was two-line hockey clubs, and and two lines would sit, and 3 or 4 D would sit, and it was the norm in junior hockey, and unfortunately for me, I had some junior coaches that didn't buy into that, and so I take all the experiences and I kind of muddled them together, and there was a defining year that I remember. It was 1990-91. It was the first year I coached midget AAA, and I was 25 years old, and I had all these thoughts on how to be a good coach. And I take aspects from all my previous coaches and I mold them together. And one of the things that I came up with is, obviously it's not only just the bench management. That's just one of about 10 things that can help you be successful. But bench management is one of the most critical, because that's what creates the experience for the kids. And seeing people sit on a bench, as a coach, I don't know how anybody does it, to be honest with you, unless it's for a disciplinary reason, or they're not working at the level they should be, or they're not following the team rules, or whatever it is. I understand that, but to watch somebody just sit there and watch everybody else play, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of what is called a team. And so over the years, I've always felt that the team's overall well-being was more important than any individual's ego. And so in that year, it was a 90-91 North Star team. And in the selection of that team, I had a lot of knowledge of the kids because I'd coached a lot of them in Bantam. And I'd provided this same process because for some reason back then, and apparently it's happening now, the numbers of players that you were allowed was very unusual. It was 11 forwards and 6D and 2 goalies. And, and of course, I could never figure out why it was 11, but that was the rulings back then. So this whole process came from that component, was that you were allowed 11 forwards. And so I began just trying to figure out a way to create a better team atmosphere and how to utilize that. And so that was kind of the start of it all. And what I found is that the process, which really is, I found the most important thing is to find players that had like chemistry and getting them onto lines and leaving them on lines. So with 11 forwards, you're -1 player. Well, instead of mixing up the lines continually, I created a way so that there would be 4 units all the time, and that to mix the players up continually wasn't productive. But in different ways, you could actually get some of your, I guess, more skilled players playing with your foot soldiers, your heart energy players, and it became productive if you could get them still playing with their own lines, but also moving in together. So, that year, which ironically, we did win the national championship that year, right from the start, we were playing up against teams that were 2-line hockey teams. And most of the quadrant teams were 2-line hockey teams. But we were a 4-line hockey team, -1. And I think, in the end, the ability and the flexibility in what we created a better team atmosphere. And we had, and the most important thing with 4 lines is high energy for 60 minutes. And the process deals with, basically 3 lines of 3 and 1 line of 2. And in the first period, you take your top line or your whatever line you want, and they'll double shift all three players. The important part is, as long as the whole group, all the team get the double shift kind of equally, they feel a part of it. But it's also a way to make sure that your energy for all throughout the whole game is there. So in the first period, I'd always take, whichever line, and I would double shift all three players into the, I guess I call it the third line slot. And so instead of just rotating the center iceman, which meant they would be, with different wingers all the time, I would double shift that first line in the first period. So what that would mean is that, it'd be an extra 5 shifts probably per kid in that first period. So then in the second period, we would take and switch the first line or the second group, put it on the top level, and they would double shift for the whole second period. And then the real key was, in the third period, is taking that third group and getting them to double shift. And, and ultimately the distribution of ice would create so everybody could have more energy. Now, the most important part about it all is that you have to teach everybody how to be solid players in their own end and create a curriculum that everybody gets taught all the same things so that they can all participate together. And so the energy, and we're always known, like, I guess the teams that I coach, as being high energy for 60 minutes, disciplined, which is vital to the success of any team. And then you throw in the bench manage, where I found that if you gave all the kids the same opportunity and leave it in their hands as to how much ice they earn or things that go on, it just became more effective in building the team. But it also gave you a huge flexibility. And what I found is that sometimes you do come across the players that have, I guess, more scoring stats and more, higher end players. As long as they can get the same amount of points, I found, in the season as they would if they were double shifted, they were happy. And the best way to do that is to make them more efficient in less amount of time. So I found that, say your first offensive line that double shifted in the first, hopefully you'd get a lead with your team. And then in the third, when you're playing up against 2-line teams, they would have more energy and they would score more in the third period in less amount of time against tired teams. And that's kind of the art of, how we won those national championships was, we came up against, some great teams that year. The second best team in the country was the Buffaloes. And, they were really well coached, except I thought they used too few players. And in the end, when we beat them in the series, it was because we had more energy and more discipline and a better team. They had more talent. That's kind of one of the things, is you can take you always need a certain amount of talent on your team, but you can make up for a little less talent with a more rounded athlete who's a better listener, who will play within the structure of your team. And so I just found that process was the most effective way with 11 forwards. Now, sometimes if you got into injuries, and you're down another one, even with 10 players, you can do the same process of double shifting. You just create, 4 units again. So instead of going to 3 lines and 1 guy, I would go to 4 lines and I would double shift 2 lines throughout the game and then switch around. So you end up having, 5-man teams, really, with 4 lines. Because once again, I think that the funnest factor is when a coach can understand chemistry of lines and put the right kids together, because they have more fun. And ultimately, there's different levels of skill. I understand all that. But the more that a kid gets to play with like-minded players, the funner they have. and I'm finding what I'm seeing a lot of is that some of the breakdowns is just in chemistry of lines.
Carey, I've got a question. I don't know if everybody was able to look at your PDF that I sent out last night, but um, I'm trying to get a picture in my mind of what you're saying, and I understand it better now. But you've, I think, taken it to another level with 11, 10. Now, I'm asking a question. When you pick your team, do you create in your mind, yes, these are the first line, second, third, fourth, and the fourth is 2 players. So in the first period, only line 1 gets double shifted. Second period, line 2 gets double shifted. Third period, the other line gets double shifted. And
Well,
then
a lot of times I'll mix it up. Like it's not always when I say the top line, the line that gets the most points.
yes,
A lot of times we'll start the game double shifting, but usually it all depends on the depth of your team too. Like I don't like categorizing kids because I know there's energy foot soldier players that can play on the top lines and help those lines be better. But the last sheet of paper that I sent, it was a kind of a mocked up model of, at the U18 level, I would go into picking the team and, because of the depth at the time, I would be looking for, 17-year-old second years to be on the first line, and then 2 first years of more offensive abilities with a 17-year-old, and then the bottom, or not the bottom, but the third and fourth lines would always be 17-year-old energy foot soldier players. Because I found that sometimes the 16-year-old first year skilled player, when they went head to head with an energy player who was a year older, they would lose the plus minus. So, the 16, putting a whole bunch of skilled players sometimes on the same team doesn't, in youth development anyways, does not necessarily help that 16-year-old talented player. So I would literally, with the 11 forwards, there would usually only be 2 first year or 16-year-old players, the 2 most skilled players on the team. And the other ones would be 4 skilled sort of players and then 5 foot soldier energy great kids, because their energy and their physical strength, and at different stages it changes, but they can outdo those 16-year-olds that have the skill. And what I also found is it's better for that 16-year-old player to dominate and not be, if you're a 1 point a game person your whole life, or a 2 point a game, you should always play at a level where you're at that points per game. I don't think it's worthwhile to move up and become less of a player because you're struggling against older players. And so our teams always were 2/3, the second years, and 1/3 the first years on the teams that we won national champion. And it was the exact same formula that won.
Carey,
Ironically, some
you
of the
talked
best.
to me about Jay Beagle as
Yeah.
a 16-year-old. You didn't keep him on your AAA team. Exactly. Here's a story of a kid not growing fully, not mature physically, with pretty good talent. Can you talk about that? Just illustrate
Sure.
the point in the male side of the importance of taking the 17-year-old before a 16-year-old, because a lot of teams pick the talented, look at this guy, 16-year-old, who isn't ready yet physically, mentally, and they expect to be successful as a team. So if you could relate the Jay Beagle's story, I'm just marking the time of that. I think it's a great story to help sell your team selection and the importance of more mature players versus more visibly talented players. Go ahead.
So the first time I came across Jay Beagle, he was trying out for the North Stars, and he was a 16-year-old, and he was only 5'9", and possibly one of the hardest working young kids I'd ever run across. His physical strength was coming, and he had a tremendous camp, and we got down to the nitty gritty, and I just kept weighing him versus, he was going to become I guess, an energy third, fourth, like a fourth line player. And I dived into a little bit of his history, and he had spent his life playing on some pretty good teams in the communities. And one of the aspects of his game that I thought he needed to improve on was his offensive ability to score and offensive ability to dominate. And playing AAA in his first year, so I sat with him and his dad and explained my thoughts that he could have played AAA, but was that the best place for him to play that year? And my philosophy was that, at your strength and physical ability, it would be better to play AA this year and try and become a top 10 scorer, because it was an aspect of his game that he hadn't developed. He was hardworking, listened, unbelievable, and was just, and I basically made the decision mostly because there was a depth of, there was a couple more 17-year-olds that pushed him, that could do the same sort of thing that he could do, maybe not quite as well, but anyways, the dad and I, disagreed a little bit, but he did play midget AA that year. Our team had a lot of success that year, and we brought him up throughout the year. And but what he gained in AA was he became a top 10 scorer for the first time in his life. And the next year at 17, he came in and he was kind of an energy / foot soldier type player. He had grown a little bit, but he still was only 5'10", roughly. But his work ethic was just unconscious, and his physical strength had grown. So he became our number one center in 2003. And I'm sure, Rick, you'll remember the Bison team that we played up against, because I think you weren't coaching, but I think you were cognizant of the group. But we played five games against a very good team, and we went into overtime and double overtime in 4 of those games. And we went on to win the national championship. And Jay was probably, he became a point a game guy, over a point. He'd never been over a point a game guy growing up, but in AA he became point a game guy. And then in AAA that year, he was, our number one center, and we won the national championship. And he, in credit to him, he played a 200-foot game, and one of the best listeners I ever met, and one of the hardest workers. And I think that playing at the level where he could dominate helped him become a better player. And he went on to the next year, and it's interesting because the guy is one persevering guy. He did not make the Calgary Hitmen the next year as an 18-year-old, so he played junior for 2 years. Then he got a scholarship to Anchorage. And in those years, he grew to be 6'4" at age, 19, 20, 21, 22. So all of a sudden, you got a 6'4", great skating, hard working, and he'd worked so hard and he persevered. And he said to his dad that he's kind of not interested in going back to school. So his dad found him an East Coast League team to try out for. And he went to the Idaho Steelhawks as a 22 or 23-year-old young man, and 6'4", and he made the team as a walk-on. Well, that year they won the I guess it's the Kelly Cup, and he got some notoriety from the Hershey Bear organization and the Washington Capitals, and so he moved up to the American Hockey League, and he played 2 years with the Hershey Bears, where he won the Calder Cup twice. And then Washington, they signed him to a contract, and he went on to win the Stanley Cup. So, you know, there's a story of you know, of a guy who, number one, it was him who persevered through all of the hockey things, never stopped working, and then had a later development in his body, and which, you know, he didn't stop. And I always like telling that story because he's just a great example, and you don't run across that type of examples that often. But I think playing where he should play in the years that he should play helped develop him into becoming a Stanley Cup. He's the only player in the history of hockey to win an Air Canada Cup, Kelly Cup, 2 Calder Cups, and a Stanley Cup. And you know what? Nobody even knew and this is another challenge we have in Calgary or in areas, that nobody even knew who Jay Beagle was until he won the Stanley Cup, you know, with the Washington Capitals. But credit to him. He's a hardworking and a great kid and a great man.
I want to use that story here because in minor hockey, and I'm not just talking AA, AAA, I'm talking community. It's 2-line hockey, and they're double shifting their best players to try to get outcomes too soon. Girls hockey, Calgary, we're trying to make sure everybody gets to play and develop, and they may shorten the bench for those players they perceive at 15, 16, 17 as being the best, most talented, but they haven't matured yet. So we're trying to convince the hockey powers in minor hockey exactly what you said. They're maturing, they're developing. You don't know how good they could be, but as soon as you make a decision, this is the first line, second line at U11, at U13, at U15, you're taking away from what you just described. They're born different dates, they mature differently. And I know in your case, that story is a prime example. And in your way of coaching, managing the bench, creating a chemistry with the age group boys being your energy players, your older, more mature physical boys that might not have been quite as talented, but being able to bring them onto the team to contribute to the team. So to me, you're the master of that. The fact you've been so successful, I think, is the rationale. And I'm really curious if anybody has any questions. Now, Carey, I'll get into more details, but I just wonder if anybody's got any questions, additions, or things that they may have done that is similar. It may not be exactly like Carey did, but any questions from anybody? Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, good to see you, Brack.
Hey.
Good listening. I was curious, Wally and I talked briefly yesterday. I was curious.
Oh, I lost you there.
Yeah, we got some interference from some. Are you okay now?
Yeah, I'm okay now.
Yeah, I was curious. I'm sure you did, but if you used or how you might have used that number 12 spot to reward players versus following the rotation. And I can imagine, you know, you establish it early in the year and they kind of rotation that sorry, maybe everybody else should turn their sound off. So
Yeah, I think let's all turn our sound off while he talks, okay?
yeah, you've gotten some feedback from somewhere. Anyway, how much you use that number 12 spot to reward players sort of outside of the rotation. And or, because we had very interesting conversations with Carla McLeod when she was on about a year ago, where he would religiously use all players, all situations, all year pretty much, but then had a team meeting and basically got permission of the players to really in the last half of a game going into the playoffs or in the third period, that was sort of designated sort of coach's time where she might shorten the bench a little bit to get not necessarily the point producing best players, but the players who are playing the best in a given moment or a given game to reward them a bit more and maybe exercise, even some of the best players who weren't performing well or were, really up. So I'm just curious how much you might have used that number 12 spot to do that kind of thing and how you managed it.
Oh, definitely. I think, the 12 spot, one of the keys to the 12 spot is that I think it engages everybody to want to work harder so that they can get more ice time. And, I've always been a firm believer of earned ice time, and you get that in stone with your group right off the bat. And when they get that opportunity, if they're going as hard as they can, physically they can't do that. Like the same two guys can't double shift the whole game.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
It's just impossible. And so when you get the team concept rolling and how it's better for the team that everybody gets the opportunity, then that's when you got the total utopia, because they work so hard to make sure that they keep getting that opportunity. They don't want to give up that opportunity because it's that extra bit of ice, for some of those players, and it still comes down to the work ethic and the discipline of everybody to understand that, if you're not working hard and you're not being disciplined, you're not going to get as much of an opportunity in that 12 spot. And there is no doubt that as the season goes on, I always used to break the power play up into 2 1-minute segments. And to start the season, some of my, foot soldier lines were better on the power play than some of my so-called skilled lines. But if they never get a chance to show that, so I used to use it as a challenge. We have 4 units, start the season off, and you just, and I don't keep that stat that close, but, if all of a sudden, everybody's scoring on the power play, that's the perfect world. But, the kids themselves, like you said, like if there's a line that isn't scoring on the power play, they don't expect to be part of the 1 minute, 2 minute as time goes on. You know what I mean? Like, and so the rotation in a perfect world, if you could rotate it all the way through and you're always winning and always having success, but there are times that you have to do disciplinary things. There are times where, someone had a bad day and they don't have the energy. So that's also part of the bench management, is reading all the kids as to who's actually got it that day, which is another part of the respect that you gain from your players. If you as a coach can feel what they're in and make the decisions for them as to who gets that 12 spot ice time more or less. I mean, that's a big part of it too, because not everybody's 100% every single game or every single period. And so I think as a coach, the guys that I fear the most as a coach are the guys who manage their bench and get their guys that are going the best on that ice, as much as they can within, not taking up too much ice from everybody else. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Reading your own players is vital. There's no use giving the 12 spot to the guy who's loafing. You'll give him 1 chance, maybe 2, but if you're not going, you just look at him and say, listen, obviously you don't have it today, so we're moving a little tighter here. So it is definitely a reward position.
Carey,
I mean,
you can talk about that because you can do it. I'm not sure that any of us can do it as well as you did it. From my experience watching Tom, he could do that, especially when it got down to the crunch of the late in the third period and the overtime. He really knew who to get out there because he had a feel for who was performing and They got to play. But for the average coach, and I would say 90% of the coaches we're talking about, the easiest thing to do in mind's eye is double shift the best players. They're going to get you the results. They don't seem to understand. They don't see the game well enough and judge performance and behavior during the game to take away ice time or to reward it. That's an art. So how do we get, they're just not there yet. And that
No,
concerns me is how do you get them over the hump of shortening the bench versus learning to read the players and get all the players to be the best they can be and be happy with their roles they've earned.
well, I think one of the most vital things is in your preparation of your team and in the youth development programs is you got to have the ability to have a curriculum that's simple enough that everybody can be a part of and they understand how to play. And I just go with the simple defense. If everyone can play in their own end well, it makes it so much easier. So you got to take the standpoint of I'm going to teach everybody how to be good in their own end. Because if they can be good in their own end, they should play the whole time. You should never be concerned about. Like I never matched a line in my life with that process, but I also know I was comfortable with putting everybody out at any time. And one of the things I see happening right now, which just kind of blows me away, is that sometimes your most skilled players aren't getting to penalty kill. Well, that makes about as much sense to me as because your most skilled players are probably your best penalty killers. But because of this power play 1, power play 2, penalty kill 1, penalty kill 2, or the division they've created in the model they have, they got to give a certain amount of ice time. So if you're on the power play and you're milking the minute and a half because you're the skilled sort of guy, well, you're not going to get to play the power play or the penalty kill. So, at the end of the day, I think it's a big problem in our system. And you're right, Wally. We're not. The key to the whole thing is, I think, the understanding, getting your whole team to understand how to play in all situations, and then giving them the opportunity to do it and letting them succeed or be average at it, and then help them become better at it in whatever facet that they have. That becomes the art of having a good experience for all the kids. I watched 2 kids in midget AAA. They never got in the power play all year, and and at the end of the day, you're going, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You got 2 pissed off kids and 2 parents going, well, the opportunity was never presented, so my kid never got the chance, but I just spent all this money, and and that to me is inadequate coaching. Like that is just, to not get to play, in youth development systems, you should be fired immediately. If I'm watching a coach and he does that to a kid, because you all know we've all been in those situations ourselves. Not playing is the single biggest destroyer of, the fun for the game.
Yeah, I was just a good time for me to just interject. I was going to before, and really, obviously, not so much for Brack, but for a lot of coaches listening out there.
Put your speaker off. The dog's barking.
So not so much for Brack, but for coaches listening out there, when Brack referenced before using all 4 lines on the power play, and he said, he used the words, you might end up looking at the lines that are scoring on the power play, and that's of course an element, but it's really important for a lot of coaches to recognize if you are using your lower 2 lines on the power play, are they being effective, or can they be effective to change momentum, even if you don't think they're maybe going to score, So it's important to sort of keep track if you're giving everybody opportunities. Okay, maybe one of the lines or two of the lines can generate opportunities and momentum, but they're not going to score as much. So that can be a useful tool to deploy in the right moment, where you get a power play and it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to throw them out there, and I know they're going to generate stuff, change the momentum, and maybe set the table for the more skilled lines to go out and finish the job and score on the tail end of the power play.
Well, and especially if you know, I always made a point of teaching different power plays to different groups.
Yeah.
There's fancier power plays, there's simpler power plays, and then, the change up. Like I watched the umbrella, till I'm blue in the face, and, every team uses the exact same thing, whether it's successful or not. And I bet you, the power play percentages have actually gone down because of the overuse of one power play. There's more ways to put a power play in place than just doing the umbrella. Different kids bring different things to the plate. The other thing that, I always found really important about the 12th player, is a lot of times the flexibility of putting, maybe a highly skilled player out with two foot soldiers. Power play can work pretty good, and ultimately, if they're scoring on the power play, with that 12th player being a specific kid who's just in the rotation, everybody likes to have points in hockey, and to me, the ultimate was if you could have 4 lines generating points and being plus lines, then you're going to have a lot of success, and the so-called third or fourth lines or the foot soldier lines, they should generate scoring. They just do it differently.
Carey, I'd like to speak to that because Bob Murdoch, when he coached the Winnipeg Jets, his first year, coach of the year that year, all 4 lines played the power play. He felt they had to play the way they were capable of playing. And one of the things that I teach all power plays, whether you're the most skilled, I feel the battle part of the power play is the most important part to maintain possession, keep possession, and at times the pretty players try to be fancy, keeping the puck on the outside, and they may not win the puck back once there is a shot taken. So the battle side of the power play, it's a cultural thing, but you do have to make sure it suits the personnel you have. And the pretty diagrammed umbrella, if it ain't working, then you better be able to get something working, and using a different one with the right players definitely makes sense. But unfortunately, you talked about double shifting. I find some teams double shift to the point where those 2 best players, that 3 line wingers, roll around. They play the power play and the penalty kill, and they're under 10 years old. I've seen it. So where's the development? Where is the building of character and the recognizing the importance of a team? It just isn't there. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I don't know if Jordan's back on yet, but I had a question here, and I see Sammy Joe has joined us. But one of the questions I had, obviously when behaviors went well and didn't go well, somebody stayed out too long, took a bad penalty, you took ice time away. How easy was it in the male side? I don't think it's a problem as much on the female side, behavioral coaching with your system to manage the bench when you're going to sit players who might be in the double shift situation. Like in my mind, if one unit is double shifting that period and some player has violated it, they would not get out the next time. They would not be double shifted. Does that make sense? Your speaker, Carey, turn it on.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the same dynamic rules. Can you see me?
Yes.
Kind of lost all you guys on my lap, but the same dynamic goes through. I mean, the most basic important parts when I talk to kids is that there's two things that you can control is your work ethic and your discipline. And if you want to control them in a fashion that isn't beneficial to the team, then you're going to expect the odd little, I call it an encouraging word, or you're going to get, maybe a little less ice time. But the same principles happen. And if you don't want to work hard for your 50 seconds or you don't want to be disciplined, like, bad penalties are an easy thing to get rid of, in my mind. And I don't understand why everyone's having such a difficult time doing them because, bad penalties are bad penalties. Talking penalties are bad penalties. We got a systemic problem in our hockey programs where trash talking has become okay. Well, it isn't, but it's up to the coaches to use, their systems and their bench management to nullify, what I would call, bad behavior towards the other team or bad behavior toward officials. That to me is a simple thing to get rid of. But it doesn't seem to be happening as much, if you know what I mean. So, it's, that's part of, the bench management too. But all that happens too, Wally, is that let's just say there's a couple kids that aren't, up to it that day, and all of a sudden you have two kids that you got to sit, and I've never sat anybody for longer than 2 shifts, maybe a period. I mean, if they were really offside in their behavior, they might get a period, but they know because you've pre-set up the whole parameters of how your team's going to operate. The kids know, when they've gone offside, and it doesn't take long for them if you've done a good job of preparing and getting them ready with the work ethic and the discipline. That, like, to me, if we can get across, the behavioral part of hockey, which is simple, getting kids to work hard and play discipline, and you're probably further ahead than anything. But I see so much behavioral challenges in what's happening in youth hockey, and the coaches just they allow it. Like, I just to go and tell the referee where to go, well, and then they're out the next shift on the power play, and like it doesn't make much sense to me. But if you're going to allow an individual to abuse an official, you shouldn't be rewarding him with extra ice time. And I watched it. And dumbfounded by how that simple behavioral thing, kids are getting rewarded because of their talent level. And what you're really doing is you're not really making that kid a good young, person in society. What you're doing is you're adding to his own ego and his own challenges that he's going to have later on in life.
Carey, I want to mention just what you said there. That, to me, the male side is why we have the problems we have with elite players as they move up to national teams, whether it's a junior or what. We're not teaching them behavior, respectful behavior on the ice. And as they go up the ladder and gain more recognition, they're behaving in a way that is unacceptable off the ice. And I really believe that that's my involvement in the game today, but primarily on the female side. I've given up on influencing the male side, but I still am attempting to influence the male side with that mission statement exercise about what are you coaching for? You coach for the life skills of respect, effort, trust, and you are the coach who develops that with your athletes because that's what sports should do. and it's not happening on the guy's side. But to some degree, there's entitlement going on, judgment of players not playing because they're not as talented, and they sit and watch, even on the female side. So it's about development, and I just wanted to get that point in. And I don't know if Sammy Joe is on. Sammy, I've got a question for you. And
Wally, before you go to Sammy, I just wanted to interject that.
Okay.
I mean, I totally agree with everything that Brack has said. And, you know, the discipline part comes easy to some coaches, not enough, but it's tough for a lot of young coaches, especially in the face of parental pressure, because the parents often don't, strangely, don't see the value in disciplining a player for, you know, bad behavior. And, you know, really for a lot of young coaches, it's important to keep in mind that even though you might be uncomfortable trying to deal with it, you're doing the player a grave disservice if you allow it to happen. Because eventually, if that player is a real good player, eventually he or she are going to run into a coach at a higher level who will be willing to deal with it, and the player will not be equipped to handle that kind of situation. So it's a real disservice to your players to sort of, oh, well, you know, that can happen to anybody, or let it slide or not deal with it. It's really, really important to help them develop that skill.
I'll tell you one thing, you know, I haven't heard much from Rick Puttick, but I watched his teams for years, and, you know, he had ways of, his team was always one of the most disciplined teams, one of the hardest working teams. And, you know, I have a lot of respect for Rick as a coach because of the way his behavior of his team, and it always helped them, you know, be more successful. And so, Rick, you know, kudos to you, because, you know, you were one of the guys who I noticed over the years that, you know, what we're talking about, and we always sometimes are talking, you know, to the choir here, but, you know, Rick, his teams were spectacular in both fields. And, you know, credit to Rick. I'd like to hear some of Rick's views on it, because, I mean, he's gotten to watch an awful lot of it over the years. And, you know, he's only been retired from coaching from a few years, but his processes and how he would achieve what he did, he did a great job all the time.
Rick, can you comment? Rick is going to be coaching this year. He's taking a full-time job.
Oh, perfect.
In a junior league in Alberta. Rick, are you on?
Yeah, right here, Wally.
Go ahead, Rick.
Well, thank you, Carey. Appreciate the thoughts. I agree 100% with what Tim said. If you don't give your players at a young age the right direction, you just allow them to perpetuate the bad habit that they are forming. And when someone does challenge them, as Tim suggested, it can be a terminal challenge, because if they don't correct themselves, which becomes extremely difficult at that stage of the game, they're gone. Somebody else will replace them, and that's a price that's too high to pay, if in particular when it could have been and it goes to coaches, as was stated, just not having the, I'll use the wherewithal term again, Wally, the wherewithal to push back in those situations, despite parental pressures, despite organizational pressures, because of the stature of a given player as a talent. In my environment, I set discipline criteria right from the get-go before we ever hit the ice with both parents and players. And quite frankly, I knew someone would push back just to see how genuine the concerns would be. And I actually hoped it would be one of the profile players. Because if you're going to deal with it with them, then everybody else knows you mean business. To pick on your 18th and 19th guy on your roster isn't going to make any difference. If he deserves it, he's going to get the discipline. But the lesson isn't delivered up line. The lesson has to be delivered down line, and it's surprising how often it played out that way, which really contributed to getting it established and that becoming a factor, as Carey graciously alluded to the success that the teams had. Control the things you can. You'll be better in position to control the things and all the variables that go into playing the game inside the boards.